Next, we have Carolina Abenante from NYIAX. She's the founder and chief strategy officer there. Carolina.
Thank you. Richard, are you here? Come up as well, because we're going to sort of. I'll take the clicker. No, I can take the clicker. So what we're going to do is is it on? Yeah. So we're going to sort of tag team this. You can come right here. Yeah, and we're kind of tag teaming this because there's two different ideas of what we're going to do. We're going to do the first one about smart contracts, smart legal contracts, which is really what the new standard is, and I'll explain that. And then we want to have Richard talk about the technology and how smart contracts work with the technology. Just a little bit of background, I'm the founder of NYIAX. NYIAX is partnered with the NASDAQ, and we created a forwards and futures exchange for buying and selling advertising and retrading it. We are not an F1, so just in case you were thinking about selling your ICOs, we don't do that there. And hopefully somebody will be doing that soon. So I hope this moves forward. So let's just talk about what contracts are. And don't want this to be a primer for a 101 in contract law, but understanding contracts to begin with actually helps with smart contracts. Because smart contracts, as everybody knows, or doesn't know in this room, is really how to use technology to self-effectuate portions of a contract. But legal smart contracts are now what Smart Contract Alliance, which I'm a member of from the Digital Chamber of Commerce, is the new idea of how contracts and smart contracts are going to work, and has been adopted by all 50 states and the District of Columbia. So that is something that we have to start addressing now. Wait, I'm going the wrong way? Okay. Okay, so what are contracts? We're talking about something that's legally enforceable, how we're going to bind people together to doing something. And really, we need to know also what blockchain is. And how I look at blockchain is it's a database with a memory that can't be altered. What we're placing in there is not going to be altered. And we're always talking about what kind of contract that will be. What type of relationship are we going to have between the parties? So what are smart contracts? And we've seen smart contracts in a number of forums. This is not the first time. Smart contracts don't just exist with the blockchain. They've existed for years. The vending machine might be something that we're talking about for a long period of time. But with smart contracts, in the sense of using it with a technology, we're going to use some kind of contracts bound by some kind of computer protocol. And that's why we use that vending machine. When you go to your vending machine, you're putting in your quarter or your dollar, what have you. You're getting your Coke, and you're not complaining about what were the parts of the contract that you didn't like. You got your Coke. That's it. So are smart contracts legal contracts? Well, it depends. I mean, everything in law always depends. That's the first thing that any attorney will ever tell you. Everything depends on what we're going to be doing. Some yes, some no. You know, they're based on what we're looking at with smart contracts when we're looking at it from a computer protocol system. They're based on if-then statements and how they assess it from a legal time period. Now, that works with vendors, and we are all vendors or merchants in this room. So we can bind people to these contracts. Where smart contracts don't work as well is where public law comes in, where we have the retail community that's coming into this, or where you're having a community that is talking about, like with, I mean, I always place divorce up there, or other things that are contract-based as well, but you have both state and in certain areas, not with divorce law, but others with federal law that comes in, that is taking the place of how we should deal with the contract in and of itself. What are the issues? What happens when the agreement, and this was taken from Georgetown Law Review, what happens when the agreement can be enforced, not by public law enforcers, by the terms and mechanisms that we're creating? How do we do this in a way so that they can self-effectuate on their own? How do we make it so that there's less people that are touching these contracts? How do we do that? What are the formulations of the words? How do we create standards around that? And that's why when Michael Palmer was talking about standards, they work hand in hand with smart contracts. Are smart contracts law foreign to contract law? Absolutely not. There is little to no difficulty situating smart contracts within contract law in and of itself. And that's a great thing for us because we want to start binding every party part of it. And we want those pieces that are going to be self-effectuating, whether it's going to be the viewability or the distribution of funds, to be something where people are not going to come back and question those areas of contract because people are using set standards and set rules to let certain aspects of it self-effectuate. Less people, less hands that are coming into the mix, less back and forth, less negotiation. This is the idea of compliance. What paved the way for smart contracts law? This is the most boring thing on anything that you will ever see. It's been around for a long time. We've been looking at this all the way back in 1999 with the adoption of UTA. These are about signing. People think electronic signatures are not big deals, but for lawyers, that was a very big deal for us. In order to have that, we needed to have state adoption for it. Then we had federal adoption with e-sign in 2000. This allows us to do transactions without having to have people come to an office or go to a notary in order to do these things. It's extremely important and has set the precedent for doing this. There's also the Accord, and I think that a lot of people should also become members. It's completely free for the Accord project because this is making smart contracts the methodology that you want to work in. And everybody's a member from IBM to Pfizer to Microsoft. And if you want to learn more, you want to be part of it, and you want to have your voices heard in how you want to do it, it's a simple methodology and being part of it. We've been a part of it for about, I think, 6 months to almost a year. What are the three formations of contract? Okay. We also look at offer acceptance and consideration. But there's also the idea of formation of a contract. Performance and modifications. What are we going to do to change the idea of the contract? Modifications that come into a contract. Enforcement and remedies. When contracts don't work out the way we want them to work out, what do? Most of the times now we go to our lawyers. We complain. We deal with negotiations. What are the remedies for this? Many people place inside their IOs cure dates for remedies. They also place in possible percentages that will be eked back from this. Can we do all of this and set this up in the beginning so we don't have to have the back and forth on the phone, that we don't have to have the paper going back and forth? We can. And that's why smart contracts and smart legal contracts are so important. Contract formation, I'm going to go through this very quickly because this is something that each person's going to have a little bit of a different idea on how they're going to create their formation from it, and it's really standardized in contract law. But we look at formation, how the two minds meet together. What is the bargain? What is the consideration that's going to exist? What is mistake and misunderstanding? The use of computer codes to minimize future conflicts that we're going to have. Let's put them in the beginning. Let's set the rules now. Is there ambiguity? Artificial language must be complete and predefined. This goes back to standards that we're going to create so that the formation in the beginning, when we first create that IO between the two parties, we're both on an equal playing field. And because we work with also the financial exchanges, this has already been done by the financial exchanges, so we should take precedent from where we can. And if we look at that, we can make a much better system for both blockchain and for anything else we want to do. Performance and modification in smart contracts. A contract, the thing about smart contracts is you only know about them after they perform, which is the most interesting thing. So a contract can be performed, modified, or breached. Offer a tool to solve the ambiguity problems for performance issues. Set that now. Set that from the onset of what you're going to do. So if there's modifications down the line dealing with viewability, what is your metric that you're really going to accept on what is that viewability standard going to be? Is it going to be 90%? Is it going to be 100%? Check it at the beginning, have both parties agree to it. It works as your standard of truth. Modifications, impossibility, and impracticability. These are all legal terms that work inside contracts. These are all things that are post-formation issues, but they can be done from the beginning, that can come in if you agree to them. Smart contracts can update to incorporate these changes at any point in time if you have set rules that work, that everybody abides by. What's the burden on the parties, their agents, to update this code? Well, it's learning by doing. So in the beginning, if we have a set standard within an industry of what we're going to be looking at the formation. These are certain things that we can look at and actually value now. And you can do setified, modified terms. So these are terms that we can have that can come in, that parties have agreed to in the beginning, that can be brought in at any time of post-formation as well. Enforceability, I'm not going to read this piece. Will enforceability and remedies, you can place them in from the time on the onset of your contract. They can be made self-effectuating, so that's not a problem. You can deal with transactions within the digital ledger itself. All of this also was from dealing with Andreas Sherborne, who, if you want to read anything, I will give that to you later on. This is with blockchain for smart contracts. This is a basis of almost everybody that's doing financial transactions, and it's been used in a modicum many different areas. It is definitely applicable for the digital industry. Okay, so let's go back and forth now. Let's go into the public versus private, because this is something that we want to do.
So we wanted to just touch on the differences as we see it from with smart contracts related to public and private. So there's some different methodologies needed in terms of the places where smart contracts will be applicable, right? So you see on the left we've got our typical public, and on the right we've got our typical private permissioned blockchain setups, and as you see inside the public, you're much more open to everyone seeing all that contract, all the information that would be inside it, and that changes the use. So on the right, you've got the same kind of B2B style access that you would have to data and various information that's in those contracts, and therefore you can essentially store and be comfortable that what's in smart, not just in blockchain itself, but what's actually in the contract is safe from folks that you wouldn't want to see that information. For instance, deal terms, right? If you don't want deal terms to be exposed in the pricing, and which is something that B2B has critical at its core. So I think it's really, as far as smart contracts are concerned, right? Why I think we're not seeing a lot of activity on the legal side with smart contracts in a public form is because some of those deal terms are non-public. They shouldn't be public. They should be permissioned. So it's important to have that in the perspective when you think about smart contracts. And there's particularly when you talk about smart legal contracts, when you're talking about documents that would typically be in the private domain, right? They would typically be stored in a filing cabinet. They wouldn't be public. You wouldn't normally share those records. So that's an important consideration. I won't go through the rest of this because it's more focused on a general description, and I think a general description of public versus private. I also, it's important to understand the implementation with some examples, right? So what you see here is the types of blockchains. You see the open, the closed, and you see the public and permissionless, and consortia and private, fully private on the left-hand side, and just to give some layman view over that description. Bitcoin and Ethereum obviously are fully public and permissionless. Those areas, anyone can commit, anyone can write, anyone can read. Right, so that's the example there. That's somewhere where you, as a business, you probably don't want the full transparency into what you've written into the contracts between two B2B partners, as an example. And then on the other side of the coin, you've got, bank ledgers in network operator only, only people you've given access to that information, right? So it's a different view of the same problem. And I'll skip over this because it's really helpful as a follow-up for you guys to just check if you're working with partners or you're working with it yourselves, just to kind of step through what are the things, what is the framework you can use to evaluate whether the smart contract provider, the way the provider you're working with is dealing with smart contracts is the right partner for you or the right way to deal with it yourself internally with your company. Okay, so let's summarize, right? So Carolina's already gone through with us what a contract is, what a smart contract is. You know, contract, we all understand contracts. We've had them, we've worked with them for many years. Smart contracts is essentially a protocol that executes. It's a computerized version for code execution, so we can essentially self-effectuate things downstream. And the combination of those two things essentially is a legally enforceable code execution, as Carolina has walked us through. And we don't necessarily focus this around NYIAX. This is kind of a deck that we have generally internally, but I do want to point out that a critical part of this, like Carolina was saying before, was this idea of a taxonomical structure, a standard essentially, right? That it's required that everyone understands the same, is working on the same language, right? So that's why we're doing, that's what we're doing inside the IAB, that's what the groups and Dustin and Miguel and some leaders inside the group are working on, is making sure that we've got that common data dictionary, that we're talking the same language, that we ultimately end up, and that's, we believe that at our core as well at NYIAX, and that's, so we tell that story independently, and particularly what we see is what really needed inside the industry, particularly given the experience we have with the financial markets, is this rules that are governed. No, we're not a regulated market, right? So in the advertising market, we're not a regulated market. It's really important to recognise that having the rules and governing ourselves is a critical step that's needed in order to make sure that the data that comes into this technology is not garbage in, garbage out, right? And that's a challenge we have generally, which we, the IAB, the IAB helps with its standards and with its collaborations across the industry. But it's very important point, because having those standards and the creation of that data that ends up on the chain through these rules is an opportunity, I think, for the industry to finally realise that the more common collaborative environment where we don't create silos of information or create silos, pockets of advantage for larger organisations rather than just the overall good of the industry. Don't feel we need to explain the detail of blockchain here for you guys. I think it's quite clear that there's a set of blocks that link to each other, and you can see from the visual that that's the case. But I do think it's also really important for us to touch on these three layers, right? Which is something is going to be in our primer. It's something that's an important part of the overall picture here, and that's that there are this protocol layer, which essentially is the underlying DLT, distributed ledger technology, which ultimately is like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Hyperledger, which is the public versions of these, and Hyperledger being a consortia-based style. And then there's this network. There's the participants on the network. There's a networking layer essentially, where there's information flowing inside, connected to both the protocol layer and ultimately the application layer, which is a very specific business utilization. I think back from a smart contracts perspective, I think actually there's application in each one of these areas, and it's important to understand that, right? So on the application layer, it's different from the protocol layer. From a protocol layer, if you look at Bitcoin, Ethereum, and some of the more, the cryptocurrency, I mean, the smart contract is really defining the transfer of the asset from one party to another, right? But in the networking layer, it could be defining the use of data inside, and that governs the transfer of that asset from one party to another. And on the application layer, sorry, go on.
Sorry to interrupt that. I just had a question. Is the smart contract, it's being verified by the blockchain, or the provisions of the smart contract in each block?
So I'll just state the question again. So you're asking, is the smart contract? Sorry, you're going to have to repeat it again. So I didn't quite hear the last.
Yeah. So if I'm thinking about using a blockchain-based smart contract, are the verbiage, the terms of the contract, are they housed in each block, or is blockchain used just simply to verify all of the points and the revisions and the modifications of the contract?
The smart contract, it can actually be used in multiple places, but the core of the functionality of a smart contract is to write essentially a set of rules that are agreed on by all parties and they're executed by each node, right? But it depends a little bit on how the overall architecture is set up, right? Because you can have, like I'm suggesting here, right, in the application layer, you can have a different set of rules than the networking layer and than the protocol layer, right? So it depends a little bit. So as an example, you might have an application layer which is on a completely different blockchain implementation than the protocol layer, right? That could happen, right? And I think we're a little bit early in our ecosystem, right? So I think the point here is when you're looking at either companies you're working with or you're working with yourself, to recognize that you have to identify whether you're working with an application layer, a networking layer, or a protocol layer, right? And whether that's important, because then you can start to answer those questions in a bit more salient way. Okay. So I think, just to finalize, I think we see the record, the initial steps in the workflow around smart contracts, and there's some more detail that Dustin and Miguel and the sub-working groups are working on here, which will come out. But I think the important point is that ultimately you're agreeing and you're recording the agreement, right? If you think about smart contracts from a more legal perspective, right? And that's one step in the process, right? And that has to be agreed by the parties that are involved in that transaction, not just the two parties who are transferring money between each other, but also the parties who may be verifying, for instance, right? That's an important part too, right? You need to upfront verification that those parties are ultimately agreeing to do something together. The second is that you're ultimately connecting with the external systems that will be providing data for verification or for some downstream account transfer or so on and so forth. That's happening during the process. Then you finalize by evaluating whether that's true across all of the other participants inside the network. So it's not just a centralized approach. And the last is obviously the actual real value that's being provided in the long term by this technology, which is to take a lot of human steps out of this process and self-effectuate the rules that were defined at the beginning. From this, I see it's important to understand that there are, like Caroline said at the beginning, there are portions of legal contracts which can be brought onto smart contracts. Not all of them can, as Carolina mentioned. Some of the things that are brought on are not. Sorry, some of them cannot be brought on. There's some examples that Carolina gave, which I won't go back to, but a lot of the steps that we take in this industry can be, and that's still today. So that's what we're working hard on inside the IAB to define and make sure that it's clear to everybody. So I'll end there.
No, we're looking for what we really want, and I hope that's what everybody else wants, and I know it's what the IAB wants, is we're trying to look for standards that we're all going to work under. Because if we do, from a front-end compliance of creating the order or transaction to the back-end compliance of verification to anti-fraud to distribution of funds, we can start seeing enormous savings from this. Because the more that it is the same taxonomic structure, the same sort of ideas, all by placing and implementing similar ideas on smart contract. Now, it doesn't have to be the same, but it has to have a similarity. The sky's the limit. We can also do something which I think DSPs always wanted to have at one point in time, which was the idea for best pricing, to move from one place to another, since you don't have to go through another general application layer from another. So that's, yes.
Is there a legal framework to think about bugs? I mean,
Yeah.
smart contracts are essentially programs. So
Yes.
who's responsible when a bug creates unintended consequences?
Absolutely. So when you have that, if there's going to be primers that's going to go out on this. The Digital Chain of Commerce with the Smart Contract Alliance, we talked about how we would deal with the liability for who would have a liability on it. Now, when you're talking about liability for bugs, it depends on who wants to be the drafter for it. So as long as you agree on the terms and you agree on what your remedy is going to be for that, it's whoever fixes it. Now, is it a full cure? Is it this? It's going to be dependent on the contract itself. And that doesn't take away from the taxonomic structure, but it can already be embedded inside of it. And that in itself can then self-effectuate. Nothing else? All right. Thank you very much.